During the Progressive Age, there was a real clash between the dominant Victorian culture and the changes socially attendant to the Industrial Revolution. A lot of reforms grew out of this cultural conflict, some seeking to preserve the old order and others advocating change. In this section, we'll look at some of the battles that took place regarding the family, morality, and the role of women in society. When you think of Victorian culture, you tend to think of British Queen Victoria. Victoria ruled Great Britain for almost 40 years in the mid to late 19th century, and she came to represent a culture that stressed morals, manners, and proper behavior. It stressed modesty and restraint. There were rules and roles in Victorian culture assigned, and society should follow them. Of course, for many Victorians, the rules are breaking down with the Industrial Revolution. Society was changing. Not only was there urbanization and the influx of new immigrants and new cultures, but for many Victorians, society seemed to be slipping into sin. You could see things like the spread of vaudeville. Vaudeville was real popular, especially among the working classes, and it offered sort of a bawdy routine of sexual innuendo, sort of a play and singing, and it really shocked a lot of Victorians. In New York City, there were areas like Tin Pan Alley where there were a lot of music halls and partying going on. There was the spread of music such as ragtime, which came up from the Black South, and through much of the staid Victorian culture, this was all shocking and worrisome. This dynamic culture is going to lead to a number of reform movements. One of the leaders of an effort to restore moral purity and improve society was Anthony Comstock, a dry goods clerk who championed Victorian morals by establishing a New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. And it would go around protesting and breaking up gambling halls and lottery operations and pornography. The Comstock Law, named for Comstock, passed in the 1870s, and it made it illegal to deliver by the U.S. mail or other modes of transportation, quote, obscene, lewd, or lascivious materials. It also prohibited publication of any information about contraception or abortion or anything about the prevention of sexually transmitted diseases. Not surprisingly, alcohol was a focus of many reformers. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1874, and the Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1895, included a number of Protestant clergy and prominent middle-class women. Women in Victorian culture were kind of seen as upholders of virtue, and they were driving force of the temperance movement. Women were sugar and spice and everything nice, and guys were a different creature altogether, puppy dog tails and snails and all that. They were libidinous and couldn't be trusted, but hardworking. It all worked together in the nuclear family, but women played a central role, and that included stopping alcohol from their menfolk. While many Victorians worried about the future of the American nuclear family and traditional morals, the threat from things like prostitution or alcohol, another group of reformers approached the dynamic culture from a complete different perspective. Challenging the traditional subservient role assigned women, Alice Paul and her allies argued that women deserved the right to vote, so-called suffrage rights. In many ways challenging the dominant Victorian culture, these reformers argued that the dynamism offered opportunity for equal rights for women. It would bring them into direct conflict with the likes of Comstock and his allies. A leading advocacy group was the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by the famous Susan B. Anthony. When the elderly Anthony retired in 1900, Carrie Chapman Catt of Iowa took over and proved quite successful in pushing the suffragette agenda. Some female reformers pushed against state laws banning the distribution of contraceptives and birth control. Many of the poor, they would get pregnant frequently, and it was a threat to their health and to their babies and to their chance to earn a living. And in 1914, Margaret Sanger of New York, who was a practical nurse and socialist whose mother died of bearing 11 children, she began her crusade for birth control, a term she coined. When her journal, The Women Rebel, faced prosecution on obscenity charges, Sanger actually had to flee to England. Sanger was able to return in 1916, and she opened in Brooklyn the nation's first birth control clinic and launched a new journal, the Birth Control Review. She founded the American Birth Control League, which is sort of the ancestor of today's Planned Parenthood Federation. You know, she was arguing it was a matter of women's rights. If women were subservient and were being denied contraceptions, they'd be pregnant, and always be dependent on the men. How many children a woman should have should be the decision of the woman, people like Sanger argued. Sanger wasn't alone. Mary Ware Dennett was another advocate of birth control, and she actually published a book, The Sex Side of Life, that was banned as obscene in 1919. Anyway, Sanger tended to promote direct action and wanted physicians to have the right to supply contraceptions. Dennett wanted more lobbying efforts, and she also called for widespread distribution of contraceptives. So there were some differences, and indeed, both these women sort of the relationship between them eventually soured in spite of their common cause. Of course, there's tremendous resistance against all these social reforms. Suffrage and birth control, critics claimed, would undermine men's employment and, more importantly, God's design for the nuclear family. In many conservative southern states, and evangelical Protestantism, and throughout much of America, the Catholic Church, argued that men were intended for business and politics, while women were intended for family and education, the necessary and important vessels of virtue. To have women's suffrage and women's rights would be to undermine God's nuclear family and destroy society. You can see this resistance in the flyers and newspaper stories here. Victorian culture saw sex as something reserved for marriage and procreation. The idea of female contraception implied that women were having sex without the need to procreate, and challenged the entire Victorian idea of family and social order. Throughout the Progressive Age, the battle over culture and women's rights and things like contraception and morality was often intense. This concludes the section on the Progressive Era cultural reforms and conflict.